The pen hovered over the line that would decide everything. Brian Miller sat back, already counting the money he thought was his. But Joseph Harlan sat across from him, and he hadn't blinked once. The notary paused, her eyes narrowing on one signature that didn't match the rest. To understand why that signature would change everything, you have to go back 3 months. 3 months earlier, Joseph walked the fence line of the ranch, something gnawing at him, like a splinter. In the kitchen, a ranch ledger with a torn page stopped him cold. He knew every page of that book.
That page wasn't missing last week, and it wasn't Brian's business to touch it.
He checked the kitchen safe, where the family deed always stayed. The slot was empty.
His mind went to Brian, smooth talking, always pushing for future plans. Joseph knew he had to be careful now.
Before Joseph could gather his thoughts, Brian's car rolled up the gravel drive.
Afternoon, Joseph. Time we discussed the future of this old place.
He never called it an old place before, not until the developers came sniffing.
You've been forgetting things. Susan's worried. Maybe it's time I stepped in to handle the paperwork.
Joseph held his tongue, letting the younger man mistake silence for surrender.
The developers see real potential here, something you've been too stubborn to notice.
That evening, Susan arrived, her gaze filled with rehearsed concern.
Dad, Brian only wants to help. Maybe it's time you stepped back a little.
Help, or help himself to everything this family spent 3 generations building.
After they left, Joseph sat alone in his study and began piecing together a quiet, patient strategy. The next morning, Joseph's hand slid open the hidden drawer of an old oak cabinet.
The original deed was stored here, now empty. Brian had been inside this house.
But Patricia had been smarter than any of them. 20 years ago, she'd insisted on a safeguard.
If this land is ever sold without my signature on the clause, the whole thing is void. That protects Susan.
He remembered her words now like a brand, and he knew where the backup was.
An old safety deposit box slip, tucked in their marriage certificate, had never been canceled. At the bank, he opened the box and found a duplicate of the original deed, her signature bold across the bottom.
Brian forged a sale deed without this. He thought he'd buried the original, but he never knew about the clause.
Outside, the wind stirred the sagebrush. Inside, Joseph began planning the exact moment he would spring the trap.
Let them think I am old and confused. I'll be there at the closing. And so will Patricia's ink.
Alone in the study, Joseph spread the duplicate deed across his desk. His wife's handwriting had not faded. The handwritten clause read, "Any sale, transfer, or encumbrance of this property shall be null and void without the notarized signature of Patricia Harlan."
You are still protecting us, Pat, just like you promised.
He ran his thumb over the raised notary seal, then stood and walked to the old printer in the corner. One faithful copy, then another. He slipped the original into a fireproof envelope and tucked it beneath a loose floorboard. The copy he kept within reach, a silent weapon he would not have to wield until the closing table. Every detail of the original was intact: the raised seal, the precise date, and Patricia's looped, deliberate signature. It was more than a legal document. It was the last promise his wife had made to this land.
Brian thinks he's erased her, but her ink will speak louder than any lie he scribbled.
Outside the window, the ranch lay still. Inside, the old rancher had just become the most dangerous man in the room. 2 days later, Joseph pulled into the parking lot of Cole and Associates, the only law firm he'd ever trusted. Richard Cole's office smelled of old books and leather. The 2 men had shared confidences for 15 years.
Joseph, you sounded tight on the phone. What's going on?
I need to know if a clause my wife put in the deed 20 years ago still holds. Brian's trying to sell the ranch out from under us.
Richard studied the document, then leaned back. Patricia drafted this with a clean sunset provision. It's still active. If Brian forged your signature, this clause is your silver bullet.
Then I'll let him walk right into it. I want him to sign everything at closing, smug as a fox, And then the notary will see Patricia's ink.
Richard nodded slowly, already calculating the legal procedure. I'll have the original deed verified and ready for the notary when the day comes. They agreed on the quiet strategy. Let Brian sell. Let him boast. Let him sign. The undoing would come from a dead woman's handwriting.
Now I just have to nod when Brian talks about the future, and make sure Susan doesn't get caught in the crossfire.
The hardest part would be keeping Susan in the dark. She still believed Brian loved the land as much as she did. A week later, Brian arrived with a glossy brochure and a smile that didn't reach his eyes.
This is the future. Joseph, Phase 1 of Canyon Ridge Estates, right where the barn is now.
Joseph kept his face slack, but his mind saw Patricia's handwriting burning through that glossy paper.
Susan stood in the doorway, her fingers twisting her wedding ring.
Dad, maybe it's time you let someone else carry the weight. Brian says, this is the only way.
If that's what you both think is best, I won't fight it.
Smart decision. We'll fast-track the paperwork, closing in 60 days.
Joseph nodded, but beneath the table his hands were steady as a gunslinger's.
She believed she was saving him from stress. She didn't see the trap closing around her husband.
That night, the closing date was set. Brian left with a spring in his step, never noticing the old man's smile. In their home office, late that night, Brian wet the tip of a pen and began copying Joseph Harlan's signature. The ink dried on a sale deed that would transfer the ranch to a developer already paying Brian a finder's fee.
One last signature, and this old man's stubbornness would be someone else's problem.
The next morning, Susan found him at the kitchen table, circling dollar figures on a contract.
You are really enjoying this, aren't you? I've never seen you so worked up about money.
I am securing our future, Susan. Something your father never had the vision to do.
She wanted to believe him, but the way he said our future left her cold.
Joseph watched from the porch as Brian's car stirred the dust. He'd learned to read that dust.
The boy thinks he's won. He's already spending the money in his head.
By that evening, the forged deed was filed. Susan felt the ground shifting, but she didn't yet know why. Joseph returned to Richard Cole's office a week later, carrying a manila envelope that felt heavier than any rifle.
You look like a man holding a royal flush, Joseph.
The original. Patricia's clause. I want it verified and held in escrow until the closing.
Richard opened the envelope, read the clause, and nodded. Linda Torres is the most thorough notary. I'll have her authenticate every signature.
Joseph watched the lawyer make a confidential call. The request was simple. Compare, and compare carefully.
Let Brian parade his lies. The truth was already waiting in this envelope.
Richard prepared a sealed notarization request, stressing the need for signature verification on the sale documents. Linda Torres received the request with a crisp nod. In 20 years, she had never missed a forgery. When Joseph finally stood to leave, Richard clasped his arm. The day of the closing, I'll bring the verified original. You bring that patience of yours. Joseph's smile was winter cold. Outside, Joseph tucked the envelope's duplicate into his glove box. The bait was set, the trap invisible. Now he had to wear a fool's face for 3 more weeks. 6 days before closing, Brian stood in the ranch yard, phone pressed to his ear, voice carrying.
The old man hasn't questioned a thing. He signed it thinking it was a tax document. By Tuesday, this land is condos. The developer's check is already written.
In the barn, Joseph's hands stilled on a coil of rope. He listened through the slatted walls.
He wanted to walk out, but the thought of Patricia's signature steadied him. Not yet.
That night, Susan came home to Brian on the phone, his tone cold and dismissive.
I heard you call him an old fool. How could you? He's my father.
He is a fool if he thinks I care about this land. It's just an asset. Susan.
She turned, grabbed her keys, and walked out, tears blurring the porch light.
At the ranch, Joseph sat on the porch, oiling his boots for the morning he'd been waiting for. 1 week.
Susan's headlights swept across the ranch gate just before full dark. She found Joseph on the porch, his boots gleaming with fresh oil.
Dad, I think I made a mistake. I believed Brian when I shouldn't have.
Sometimes we don't see people clearly until they show who they are. Come inside.
He led her to the same couch where she'd cried over scraped knees as a girl.
He called you an old fool. He said the land was just an asset. I am scared, Dad.
Words are cheap, honey. I've been called worse by better men. What matters is what we do now.
Joseph took her hand, his calluses rough against her skin. A lifetime of work in that grip.
On Tuesday, just be with me at the closing. Trust me one more time.
She didn't have the answers, but she nodded against his shoulder, and for the first time in weeks, the trembling stopped. The morning before closing, Brian Miller pulled up the ranch drive one final time.
Everything is in order. Joseph. The developer's wire is waiting for the signatures. Big day tomorrow.
He still mistakes my silence for surrender. Tomorrow, that silence will break.
Joseph waited until the dust settled, then walked slowly to his study. From beneath the loose floorboard, he retrieved the fireproof envelope, Patricia's original deed.
You wrote it to protect Susan, Pat. Tomorrow, your ink is going to speak.
That evening, he lit a candle beside her photograph. The flame didn't flicker once. He folded the original deed and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket.
One more sunrise, then the reckoning Brian never saw coming.
Outside, the ranch slept under the same stars it had known for 100 years. But inside, Joseph Harlan was already awake. Dawn broke cold over the Harlan ranch. Susan's car was already parked by the porch.
Dad, I barely slept. I am scared of what Brian is going to pull today.
Scared is okay, but today, trust yourself and trust me.
Joseph drove in silence, the folded deed resting inside his jacket like a second heartbeat. The title office parking lot was full. A developer's black SUV gleamed near the entrance. Inside, the conference room was already filled with the smell of fresh coffee and anticipation. Brian sat at the head, laughing with a man in an expensive suit, the developer.
Joseph, right on time. Have a seat. The future's waiting.
Smile while you can. Son, your future is about to hit a wall you never even saw.
Richard Cole entered with his briefcase, nodding once at Joseph. The notary, Linda Torres, followed with her seal. Linda Torres unsealed the sale documents with practiced calm, her eyes already scanning the signature line.
This signature looks markedly different from the exemplar we have on file.
Must be his age. Shaky hand. You know how it is. It's still valid.
I'll need to see the original deed for comparison. Standard procedure.
We have it, Mrs. Torres. The original deed, preserved exactly as filed.
Brian's polished smile cracked at the edges. His fingers tightened on the edge of the table. Joseph sat motionless, his hands folded, his heartbeat as steady as a metronome. The notary laid the original beside the forged deed, peering through her magnifier.
Let her look, Brian. We have nothing to hide.
The room fell silent, except for the soft rasp of paper and the distant hum of the air conditioning.
This deed contains a handwritten clause. Any sale requires the notarized signature of Patricia Harlan. Where is that signature?
That clause is decades old. It's irrelevant. We have Joseph's signature right here.
Mr. Miller, the clause was never legally revoked. It remains in full effect. Without Mrs. Harlan's signature, this sale is void.
Brian's face drained of color. The developer shifted uncomfortably, his briefcase already half-packed.
This is absurd. Joseph agreed to this sale. He doesn't need his dead wife's permission.
No, Brian, I never agreed to sell. You forged my name on a deed you had no right to change.
Forged, Brian? You told me he wanted this. You lied to me.
Susan, I can explain. It's not what you think. This was supposed to be our future.
I am stopping this closing pending an investigation. This deed is fraudulent.
The developer stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out without a word. Brian's empire crumbled to dust in 60 seconds. Joseph looked at Brian, not with anger, but with something far colder. Certainty.
I saw what you were doing from the start, Brian. Patricia's foresight saved us. You underestimated a dead woman.
You forged Dad's signature? All those months you told me he was confused. You were lying the whole time.
Susan, I did it for us. The old man was never going to agree. I had to take initiative.
Initiative? You stole from my family. You tried to erase my mother's last wish.
Brian's mouth opened and closed, but no defense came. The room had become a courtroom, and he was the only guilty man.
You thought silence was weakness. You forgot that some men wait because the truth needs no rehearsal.
I'll be filing a report with the county recorder. This attempted fraud will be fully documented.
Brian grabbed his case and left without another word, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Susan turned to her father, her anger dissolving into sobs. But this time, the tears held no confusion. Linda Torres pressed a heavy void stamp onto the forged deed, then opened her incident log.
We will be filing charges for forgery and fraud against Brian Miller. The county prosecutor will have everything by morning.
I never want to see him again. After today, he's dead to me.
Joseph took her hand and walked her out of the room without looking back. In the corridor, Brian paced like a caged animal, his tie loosened and his eyes wild.
Susan, wait. 5 minutes. I can explain everything in a way that makes sense. Just give me a chance.
You've explained enough for a lifetime. I don't know you, and I never want to see you again.
Joseph stepped between them, his silence a wall. Brian stumbled back as if struck. Outside, the ranch road stretched ahead, empty and sure, as Joseph pulled the truck onto the highway. Susan leaned her head against the window, silent tears tracing paths through the dust on the glass. Joseph pulled the truck to a stop beside the ranch gate. Susan stumbled out and sank onto the porch step, her composure finally shattering.
Why didn't you tell me, Dad? All those weeks I was defending him, and you just let me.
Joseph lowered himself beside her, his arm wrapping around her shoulders like when she was small.
You had to see it for yourself. If I had told you, you might not have believed me, and I needed you to be free of him, not just obedient to an old man's warning.
I feel like such a fool. I almost let him sell our home.
You trusted your husband. That's not foolishness, that's loyalty. He's the one who broke it.
From his jacket, Joseph withdrew the original deed, unfolded it gently, and pointed to the clause.
Your mother's handwriting. She put this here 20 years ago, so no one could ever steal your birthright.
Susan traced the ink with her finger. The tears came again, but this time they weren't just for betrayal. 3 weeks later, a certified envelope from the county courthouse arrived at the ranch. Joseph unfolded the local paper. The front page headline read, "Local man charged with deed fraud. Brian Miller faced felony counts for forgery and fraud." The developer had already withdrawn from the deal. At the home she once shared with Brian, Susan packed his clothes into boxes with swift, determined hands.
Not one thing left that smells like his cologne. He's erased from this house.
That afternoon, she filed for divorce. Her signature on the petition was steady. On the ranch, Joseph tightened a strand of barbed wire that had been sagging for months.
The land is already healing, and so are we.
That evening, a sunbeam fell across Patricia's photograph on the mantel, as if she, too, was at peace. The Harlan Ranch sign stood firm at the gate, freshly painted, no longer shadowed by a for sale sign. Susan moved back to the ranch with a single suitcase, her divorce final. She made coffee the way her mother had taught her, filling the kitchen with a familiar, forgotten warmth.
I forgot how quiet it was out here. The kind of quiet that doesn't judge you.
Joseph simply nodded, watching her reclaim the spaces she'd left behind 3 years ago. One morning, Joseph drove to the small cemetery on the hill, a bouquet of wild sage in his hand.
We did it, honey. The ranch is still ours. Susan is home.
A warm wind stirred the grass, and for a moment, the air smelled like her perfume. That evening, Susan and Joseph sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the hills in amber and rose.
I almost lost this. I almost lost him. But we're still here.
The words were unspoken, but the land heard them. The Harlan Ranch was home again. The following Sunday, Joseph called Susan into the study. Next to Patricia's photograph now hung a simple frame. Inside the frame was no painting, only the yellowed paper with Patricia's signature and the clause she'd written.
This is what saved us. Your mother's ink, 20 years before she was needed.
Susan stepped closer, touching the glass as if the ink might still be wet.
One day, this land will be yours, but only if you promise to protect it the way she did.
I promise, Dad. I'll never let anyone take this land from us.
Her voice didn't waver. For the first time since the divorce, she sounded like her mother. Joseph led her out to the front gate, where the Harlan Ranch sign gleamed under the setting sun.
Beyond that gate is someone else's world. Inside, it's ours. Always will be.
And as the stars rose over the 100-year-old ranch, the promise hung in the air, as binding as any signature. The next morning, Joseph and Susan walked the fence line together, wire stretcher in hand. Not a word passed between them for an hour. The land didn't need small talk. She tightened a strand, and he nodded. That nod was a whole conversation.
You know, Dad, I never thought I'd enjoy fixing fences.
Fences. Keep the good in and the bad out. Same as promises.
He lifted his coffee mug in a silent toast to the hills, and she clinked her own against it. Evening found Joseph alone on the porch, his worn boots propped on the rail. The ranch stood, just as it always had, and as it always would. He closed his eyes, and the sound of the wind in the sage was all the answer he needed. Some legacies are written in ink. Others are written in the land. As the last light faded, Joseph stood on the porch, his silhouette carved against the dusk. Inside, the firelight caught the edge of Patricia's photograph, her smile unchanged by time. The framed clause hung beside her, the ink still dark on the yellowed paper. Outside, the stars emerged, one by one, over land that would never be subdivided. He had not won with rage, but with patience and a promise made long ago. And as he turned to go inside, the wind chime sang a note that sounded like her laugh. In the end, it wasn't anger that protected this land. It was love, a love that refused to be erased. One signature, penned by a woman who trusted her husband, had saved everything, and the Harlan Ranch would stand just as Patricia had always known it would.